This is going to be the update on the print run, possible print run, and plans moving forward, projects, that kind of thing, and answering a few questions that I got about either Awakening or other projects or the podcast, the writing in general. So I realized that the comment in which I said that this was coming and asked for questions was on a YouTube video. So if you're listening generally through a podcast feed like Spotify or Apple Podcasts or something, then, you can always feel free to email me. I'll usually get back to you pretty fast if you have some burning question to ask or what have you. But thanks again to everybody for sticking with it throughout the course of not just the Awakening release, but the months throughout the entire summer leading up to it, where I was pretty much just putting out reworks of older stories. Because I know that that can get old, and I don't have a consistent release schedule anyway, but at the best of times, because I only release what I feel like is good enough to release. But at the same time, it took a while to work this novel out. It was hard to get it in a condition where I felt like where I had maintained tension properly and that it flowed well. So I'm glad that everybody seems to have enjoyed it. I'm definitely going to, now that I've had a little feedback, end up doing a print on demand service of some kind. I'm probably going to have it formatted by somebody else just to save me the time and trouble of doing that. I've got a lot of wood to cut and enclosures to build before winter sets in here, so I don't know that I will... I'll have time in the next month to learn how to format a book for print on demand services and stuff like that properly. And I would like them to be not total jokes. I know print on demand can be a variable quality, but I'd like them to be at least formatted relatively well. So I'll probably get that done. It's not super expensive to do it, and it'll save me some time. That will hopefully be ready before the end of the year. Now, the way that I went about writing this novel, really in the grand scheme of things, I think horror is best served by short fiction. And I've said this in other places, but it was a good test to write this novel. But it definitely, to me, when I look back on it, does not feel as tense and rife with mood from the very beginning to the very end, as some of my short stories do. And as most good, well-written horror short stories feel, because they pack a lot of mood and climactic tension into a small space, and there's no strained and forced effort exerted to spread that over a vast distance of time and pages. So I was always nervous that it was going to span too long, and there was a lot that was cut out of this book. And that meant at the end of the day that I was happy with how the book turned out. I think it moved along fairly briskly. There was never a huge lull in the tension that narratively made it feel like less of a horror story. But at the same time, at least for a long time, maybe a few pages here and there felt a little bit more introspective. But there was never a whole passage, a whole chapter of the book that felt tame by comparison to the rest after it got going. So I'm happy with how it turned out, but there was a lot that was left on the cutting room floor, and it ended up being just shy of 60,000 words. So if we're going to say 60,000 words is the cutoff point for being called a novel, I guess it's actually a novella, technically, because it's just shy of that. It's a few thousand words short of that. So because of that, because I don't want anybody to buy a physical copy of this and feel gypped, and jointly I feel like people may also be interested in it being formatted a different way, what I may actually do with the print version of the novel is incorporate it as sort of a novella capstone to an anthology of the short stories that led up to this novel, in both the Call of the Mountain cycle and the Awakening cycle. So all of the Come the Dawn, Come the Dusk, Reclamation, those stories that had to do with the mountain and that occult group. And then And the Earth Did Tremble, Forest Through the Trees, The quirk stories, like those stories that had intimate connections to the dreamer, all of those I may put those in an anthology leading up to Awakening, kind of capping off the book. And that will make it more of a proper, like 120,000 word, like tome. So that's probably, unless people have protests to that and they would prefer kind of a clean break, just Awakening publication, that's probably going to end up being about how I go about it. That said, when it does release, whatever form it takes, don't feel the need to purchase it, like as some kind of support net for me or anything. Everything that I do will always be free online. I'm going to narrate it and read it and release it immediately as soon as I'm happy with it for free online. And I'm happy to do that. People enjoy it. I'm happy to know that there are people that still enjoy this kind of slow burn, early 20th century style horror fiction. And I'm not going to starve or freeze to death if you don't huck dollars at me or anything for the book publication. So really only buy it if you want to have a copy of it. You want to be able to leaf through it. I know I like doing that. I know there's a great value in kind of having it available to you to visually see. Like just as a throwaway, there were 3 or 4 comments after I had typed Guderian in a comment under I think chapter 7 of Awakening, of people being like, that's how you spell that dog's name. So like there are certain names and phrases, especially in the fantasy stories, that I write out that are very, I guess, convoluted or arcane. If you're not seeing them out before you, it's kind of hard to, I've seen a lot of different spellings for Aram, the name as well, which is understandable because it's a weird name. It's like a semi-made up sort of arcane sounding name that I've cobbled together. So it's, there's no proper spelling, I guess, for that name, but I spell it one way and a lot of people that say it in comments spell it a different way. So like for a lot of different reasons, to leaf through it, to have the physical weight of the book in your hands and to see things like that written out, to see the kind of narration breaks because I'll probably keep those intact, that I place in sentences for reading purposes. Like those might be interesting to people if they spend a lot of time listening to the stuff I've written. But with the print copy stuff out of the way, I think we can get on to the questions. So several had to do with whether or not Awakening was kind of the end of me writing about the Dreamer. Whether I plan to continue writing about the Dreamer, continue the timeline or whatever, whether I have considered doing a prologue of some kind. I don't, on the first count, I don't know that I will in the near future, and by that I mean in the next decade or two. So really, if I continue the timeline, it'll be way down the road. Because I feel like the point that Awakening as a novel was created to convey is very neatly ended by Luther realizing that he isn't totally tame after all, that he is capable of huge struggle and exertion in the face of peril, that he does still have some vestige of a wild animal inside him, despite being this tame sort of urbanite drone. He's still very capable of being a dangerous entity. And given that was the whole thrust of Awakening, I don't think that there's any necessity for me to continue the narrative from there. I tried to write 2 separate epilogues for this novel, and I ended up discarding both of them. And the 2 epilogues were, one was kind of a positive outcome, where the defeat of the Dreamer in the end has a positive impact, and it's a third party kind of looking in on it from afar. And one was a more negative, like it served no purpose. The defeat of the Dreamer means very little in the grand scheme of things. So it's a darker outcome. And I could not decide on which of those I preferred. And frankly, I think it's better to leave that decision up to a reader. because somebody that leans more towards the nihilistic, hyper-materialist, Lovecraftian view of things can still get the point that Luthor was capable of being a dangerous entity, while also believing that the Dreamer being stricken down doesn't reverse any of the damage that it's done, and that everything is still hopelessly, the whole of the North American continent and maybe the world is going to suffer disastrously for centuries, if not millennia to come, off the back of which just happened. And then somebody that has a much more transcendental, positive view of the world can view that as a triumphant kind of stand of humanity against an apocalyptic force in which it throws the gates wide and defeats it. So, and I don't want to make that decision for somebody as a reader. So if I do continue it, it'll be probably decades down the line when I think that there's some other commentary to be made that I want to do through the lens of the Dreamer, and I feel like it's necessary. But as for prologues or other things involving the Dreamer, yes, I definitely will do works like that. Prologues, maybe not directly, but as I said earlier, I cut a lot out of this novel, and it was almost twice the length that it now is prior to my edits that I did on it over the course of the month prior to release. And one chunk of that, probably a good 15 to 20,000 words, was a narrative about Luthor escaping Chicago and the military cordon and navigating his way to St. Louis. That story was told, it's still told over the course of like a couple pages of reminiscence in the final version of Awakening, but that story was like a 3-chapter ordeal where Luthor is navigating all the way south to St. Louis. So that is I think there are good elements to that, but I just thought when I was analyzing Awakening as a neat, concise story, that it slowed the narrative down too much. It felt too little like it, especially in those portions. His principal dangers are other human beings. And it's not so much the Dreamer's malefic, weird, semi-magical force that's spooking him or threatening him. It's other people, which is horrifying in a way, but it doesn't really fit the overall mood of the remainder of the story. So it felt alien to the rest of the narrative, and I ended up cutting it out. But things like that, I may actually either rewrite or reformat in such a way that they could be released as like a 2-hour-long short story. So it's very possible that I put things like that out that do end up kind of serving as prologues, even if they aren't like purpose-built prologues. The biggest chunk of the book that was cut out, and this ties in, I got another question when Guderian and Stan and the narrator to Forest Through the unnamed narrator for Forest Through the Trees show up in Awakening. Someone asked, like, where's Van Horn? Where's the, like, anthropologist / linguist from the horror of the Quirkwood and Forest Through the Trees? Where's he? Is he going to show up? And he did show up. Half of this book almost was Stan and the Eastern Brotherhood failing to contain the Dreamer initially. You'll recall, if you've gone through Forest Through the Trees, that Stan leaves with this group is ostensibly the Eastern Brotherhood of the Call of the Mountain, and he and Van Horn leave to try and stop what's about to happen. And because Stan shows up alone and the radio call denotes that they failed in Awakening, it's no big spoiler to say that they didn't make it. It falls to the Western Brotherhood to solve this stuff. The book initially was going to be, the whole first portion, maybe 2/3 of the book, were cutback chapters, where one chapter would focus on Luthor and the Western Brotherhood, and the other chapter would focus on Stan and the Eastern Brotherhood. And they would cut back and forth until Stan comes into the story to save them at the mouth, and then they all go in together. Now, that whole story, obviously everybody knows the end of it now. Same thing with the Luthor traveling, the story of Luthor traveling down to St. Louis. Everybody knows how this is going to end. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of passages and events and things that happen in that Eastern Brotherhood story that are still very salvageable. the reason why that got cut out, even though it was much more in line with the horror of the rest of the book, was purely because it didn't have to do with Luther. And I wanted to keep the entirety of the book, other than the one initial chapter in the prologue being kind of a different character entirely, and then the first chapter being kind of over the shoulder of Aram. The whole book was kind of over the shoulder of Luther. That's whose thoughts you're getting an introspective view of. You as a reader, or listener, I guess in this case, are right along for the ride with Luther. You are also an outsider, and you're being exposed to the tenets and operations and plans of this occult group in just the same way that he is. And I felt that Stan, while also an outsider, I painted as kind of a spiritually pre-modern man. He is a functional mountain man. He's been to war. He's an avid huntsman. He's an avid outdoorsman. And he spends the entirety of his half of Awakening, that I ended up cutting out of the final version, like surviving in the Deadlands and doing a pretty good job of it. And he's never scared shitless. He's disturbed, obviously, but he's never shaking in his boots. He's never mortified. There's never a moment where a Soraya character has to show up and drag him by the arm away from danger because he's gobsmacked. So I felt Stan was almost too, even though he was not a part of this occultic order, he was almost too vital to work as a window for an audience into this kind of story. But he's still a cool character. I wrote a lot of awesome sequences for that half of this book, and I would like to make use of them. So I may release another novella in the future with some edits and polishing done that talks about Stan and Van Horn and Malorn and Eidolon. Like, Eidolon's only ever mentioned in Awakening now, but he was he actually had a couple chapters where he was around. He was the Eastern Brotherhood's Aram. He was their figurehead. So he was the group rotated around him. There are characters like that I believe are interesting and would make it worthwhile for me to polish up that half of the book and release it. But again, probably farther down the line. I don't think, give me a couple years and we'll see about getting an Awakening, 0.5 or something released that ties up some of those narratives that were left on the cutting room floor. Another question I got asked was just a purely functional question, which is, do other things, like other than silver, hurt the dreamer or its kin or what have you? There were at one point in the work on this novel passages that went more in depth about the effects of silver on the physiology of not just the things corrupted by the dreamer, but the dreamer itself. But as I say, a lot had to be removed for length, and some of these things got cut out. But there are still hints of them there in the narrative. An example of that is that they can sink knives and picks into the flesh of the dreamer as they navigate the innards of it. But the wounds, as is said in the novel, stitch themselves shut as they remove the utensils, the tools, from the flesh. So it has a very supernatural mode of knitting itself back together, and so do all of the things that it's kind of touched with its blood. They heal in an almost supernatural, ephemeral way, and any damage that's done to them is seemingly temporary. However, it's not to say that the damage doesn't happen, that they're just not hurt by it. It's just to say that they recover quickly. Whereas silver, for mythic purposes and just because it's a good trope of Western mysticism, and a lot of mysticisms really, to have silver be dangerous to things which are beyond natural. Silver is almost caustic to it. It burns it in the way acid would. It stops that process from happening, at least for the time being, while the silver is in contact with it. So it is very possible that if you had a flamethrower and you took it to one of the hunters, like some member of a hunting pack that's tearing up a city, and you burned it to ash, it wouldn't get back up. It would be destroyed. But it would need to be something that would utterly annihilate it in a relatively quick fashion so that it couldn't heal from the wounds. If you just ripped a hole in it with like a hollow point round, It might reel. It might even lose a hand if you blew its hand, if you hit it in a joint and detached a hand or a foot, part of a limb, mowed through it with really heavy rounds. Those kinds of things would make an impact on its mobility in the short term, but all the wounds are going to heal eventually. So the sole real boon of them using silver isn't so much that it causes more damage in a physical sense, that it rips bigger holes if there are silver rounds being fired into the flesh of a dreamer mutant or what have you. It's more that it stops the process of the flesh knitting itself back together. Someone else sent me an email asking about whether or not I had considered opening a Patreon, and I don't think I have a consistent enough upload schedule to warrant doing that, because sometimes there are 3 or 4 month gaps where I'm not doing anything, and then sometimes there are months like this past month where I release an entire novella. So moreover, as I've said before, I think everything that I do is always going to be entirely free to everybody, and it'll be released the second I'm ready to release it. So there wouldn't be a lot of perks, to I don't know, subscribing to me via something like Patreon. So, and moreover, I just, as I say, I do this principally for the satisfaction of knowing that there are people that enjoy this kind of fiction out there, and knowing that I have given somebody else the chance to experience the kind of fiction that I like to read. I started doing this off the back of wishing there were more people writing the kind of antiquarian or outdated stories that I like to consume. Because when you get to the end of Clark Ashton Smith or William Hope Hodgson and Lovecraft and Bloch and Machen and Poe, and you hit the wall, and I could rattle off fantasy authors as well, Howard or Tolkien, but you get to the end of that, and then you're faced with the absolute garbage that's extant, and with some exceptions, but for the most part, absolute garbage in those genres, which exists in modernity. And it kind of depressed me when I was coming out of my teens into my early adulthood, that I didn't, once I chewed through this corpus of literature from an earlier age, there was very little to step into the gap and fill that void. And I can't promise that I do as good a job as those guys did back in the day, but I do my best to kind of write with the same methods and in similar styles and with similar narrative philosophies that they did in their work. And seeing people enjoy my work and knowing that the methods and prose and style of these other men continues to live through what I am doing is very much reward enough to me. So if you are utterly desperate and can afford to do so, I've got Venmo and PayPal links and stuff like that in the descriptions to like my podcasts feeds and the YouTube about page and stuff like that. But never feel obligated to do any of that stuff. If you're here to enjoy the fiction, then just enjoy the fiction. Don't ever feel obligated to throw $20 at me for any reason, because I'm more than happy to do it just to do it, and I would still be doing it exactly the same way that I am now if there were still only 25 people listening to everything that I did. So for now, probably not. Probably no Patreon. Now, with the principal questions out of the way, I don't have a precise schedule to hand out at the end of all this. However, I do know a few things for sure. Halloween is going to be a story related to the Delve cycle. I'll be returning to that for a short story around Halloween. I already have it plotted out, roughly. I just need to sit down in a week or two and write it in the build-up to Halloween. So there will be a release of a horror story at the end of October. Somebody earlier on, during the release of Awakening, had said that Delve was one of their favorite, sets of short stories that I had done, and was asking about whether or not I was going to ever give it the treatment that I gave the Awakening cycle with a novel. And I will at some point do that, but I'm not ready to do it yet. I've gone through 2 different versions of a Delve novel, and I've scrapped both of them because I thought the first one, while interesting, was more of a fantasy novel than a horror novel, and kind of stole a lot of the mystery of the tall men, the subterranean hominids that are the threats in the Delve cycle. That was my first attempt at a horror novel, and it focused almost entirely on the things themselves. It was some of the characters of the novel were subterranean hominids. They were tall men. And while that's interesting, it kind of is too National Geographic-esque. Like it is more of a fantasy novel where you feel as a reader, and I even as a writer, feel like I'm going into their society as almost a tourist, and it's interesting and kind of intriguing rather than being something alien and dangerous, which I think, given the tone of all of the other Delve stories, is what I would like to maintain in a Delve novel. So I just don't have a good idea for how I would wrap that novel, that series of stories up in a real kind of ultimate super narrative. I will say I've got a lot more ideas for stories, individual standalone stories in the Delve cycle than I did for the Dreamer cycle. So you will continue to get stories about oogity boogity, tall, pale, Frankenstein-looking cave people, troglodytes, in the future. There will be, after the Halloween story, there will be one more fantasy short story in November, and then that will be the last fantasy short story I release before releasing the novel next year. The novel, He Who Thunders, was actually written this past winter, and I've just been sitting on it to get some distance between myself and the writing so that when I come back to edit it, I will be not so attached to what I've done, and I'll be more able to cut it up. So that project will not take nearly as long to get ready as Awakening did, because the legwork is really already done. And there's not, even though I might tweak things about the story and the pacing, I'm not going to have to rewrite it from where I am now. So I'm pretty happy with the overall arc of that story. So that'll just be a matter of 1 month or 2 months in the coming year, probably around the late summer, early autumn. I will release He Who Thunders in a similar way to what I did with Awakening, and I think that will that'll be much less difficult for me to feel happy with the finished product at the end of the project, because fantasy, because it is such a tourist's narrative where you as a reader, or even again me as a writer, want to immerse yourself in the details and stick around and see how the world works and see the intricacies of interactions and social norms and religious customs and these kinds of things in the place that you're visiting through the narrative. Unlike horror, it kind of pays to spend a lot of time dwelling on those things. And it doesn't destroy any of the tension or mood that you've built, because you're not trying to keep people on the edge of their seat or scared or tense or uncertain about what's about to happen, at least not in the sense that you are with horror. So much less strenuous project, and it should be done sometime, within a year. After the fantasy short story in November, I've got a couple more horror short stories to release in December going into January, and my plan for next year is to try and get at least one horror story written every month for the entirety of the year. Some of them will end up being really long ones, like 2-hour-ish runtime if I narrate them Forest Through the Trees style, and some of them will be more normal, like 25 to 40-minute runtimes. I've got a big book of ideas that I haven't gotten around to yet, and I'd like to start knocking some of those out as time moves forward and starting to experiment with them. Earlier, I believe last year, I did Maw of the Earth, which was a very simple, very short story about a kind of shady artifact hunter, like, archaeological thief, early 1900s, late 1800s archaeological thief called Sias Kruger, who is kind of scouting out artifact locations and deposits of pre-Columbian treasure in North and South America to be sold via black markets to museums in the Netherlands. And I wanted to make, it's obviously, Maw of the Earth is a very simple, short, confined story, but that character I'm probably going to use to build myself a series of interconnected stories where he is visiting weird and abandoned jungle-eaten locations across Central America and South America, and even places farther north like the Grand Canyon, where these mythological civilizations and archaeological finds may or may not have existed. I can have him show up and find creepy goings-on and interact with the locals and that kind of thing. So that series will probably be continued. Delve will, as I say, be continued. So if you are ready to get back into the full swing of normal horror short fiction, it won't be very long until I start putting that out. So won't be long to wait. Thanks for listening to Awakening. Thanks for listening to anything I do here. And I'm looking forward to writing long into the future.